There was a time when installing Linux felt like a rite of passage. You didn't just install an operating system, you entered a world of partitions, terminal commands, cryptic error messages, and forum posts written in 2008 that somehow still solved your problem in 2025. You learned what a bootloader was because you had to. You memorized commands because the graphical interface either didn't exist or didn't work the way you expected. Linux was not just software, it was a challenge, and for many, that challenge was the point. But fast forward to today, and something has changed. You can download a distribution like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, or Fedora, flash it to a USB drive, click through a polished installer, and within 20 minutes you're browsing the web, watching YouTube, installing apps from a graphical store, and syncing your files to the cloud. Drivers often work out of the box. Wi-Fi connects automatically. Printers are detected without a fight. Even gaming on Linux has gone from a niche hobby to something genuinely viable thanks to compatibility layers and massive platform support. For many users, Linux is no longer a technical mountain to climb. It's just another operating system. And that raises a provocative question. Is Linux becoming too easy? And is that a problem? To understand why this question even exists, we need to look at what Linux has historically represented. Linux wasn't just about functionality. It was about freedom, transparency, control, and community. It was about knowing what your system was doing and being able to change it. The command line wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of empowerment. The complexity wasn't just an obstacle. It was a filter that attracted a certain type of user, curious, persistent, and willing to learn. When you ran Linux, you weren't just consuming technology, you were participating in it. The early distributions required manual partitioning, driver compilation, and configuration file edits. You had to understand the difference between ext2 and ext3. You had to know what grub did and why it mattered. You learned about desktop environments like GNOME and KDE because you had to choose one and configure it. You became familiar with package managers, repositories, and dependencies because things didn't always just work. That friction created a culture. Forums, mailing lists, and IRC channels thrived because people needed help, and helping each other was part of the experience. Now, modern Linux distributions aim to remove that friction, and that's not accidental. Developers realized that if Linux was going to compete on the desktop, it had to be approachable, it had to feel smooth, it had to respect the user's time. Projects invested heavily in user experience design, hardware compatibility, and simplified installation processes. The result is that someone with no prior technical background can install Linux and use it productively without ever opening a terminal. For many, that's a huge win. But for some longtime users, this shift feels uncomfortable. When Linux becomes easy, does it risk losing something essential? If the barrier to entry disappears, does the culture change? If users never need to learn how their system works under the hood, does Linux become just another consumer platform, indistinguishable from the proprietary systems it once positioned itself against? There's also a philosophical tension here. Linux has always championed choice and customization. You could tweak everything from your window manager to your kernel. But as distributions streamline the experience, they make more decisions for the user. Defaults become stronger. Configuration options become hidden behind graphical tools or removed entirely. In the name of usability, some complexity is abstracted away. And abstraction, while convenient, can create distance between the user and the system. Take the terminal, for example. It's still there, it's still powerful, but many new users may never feel the need to use it. Software centers allow you to install applications with a click. System settings, panels handle network configuration, display scaling, and user management. Even advanced tasks like disk encryption are often integrated into the installer with simple checkboxes. The terminal is no longer mandatory, it's optional. For veterans who view the command line as the heart of Linux, this can feel like a cultural shift. Yet we have to ask, is difficulty really a virtue? Should an operating system demand technical knowledge as proof of dedication? For years, one of the biggest criticisms of Linux was that it wasn't user-friendly. It was seen as intimidating, fragmented, and inconsistent. If Linux becomes easier and more accessible, isn't that simply progress? After all, the goal of free and open-source software isn't to exclude people, it's to empower them. Ease of use doesn't necessarily mean a loss of power. Modern Linux distributions often provide both layers, a polished graphical interface for everyday tasks, and a powerful command line for advanced control. The difference is that now the user can choose how deep they want to go. You can stay at the surface and still have a functional system, or you can dive into configuration files, custom kernels, and tiling window managers if that's your passion. The complexity hasn't vanished. It's just no longer mandatory. There's also the question of growth. If Linux remains difficult and niche, it risks stagnation on the desktop. Wider adoption brings more developers, more hardware support, and more software compatibility. Companies are more likely to support Linux if the user base grows. Game developers, hardware manufacturers, and productivity software vendors respond to demand. When Linux becomes easier, it becomes more attractive to newcomers, and that momentum can strengthen the ecosystem as a whole. However, growth comes with trade-offs. As more non-technical users join, expectations shift. People expect things to just work. They expect seamless updates, polished interfaces, and minimal troubleshooting. Developers may prioritize stability and simplicity over experimental features or radical customization. Community discussions may shift from deep technical debates to beginner support questions. The culture inevitably evolves. Some fear that in chasing mainstream appeal, Linux might start to resemble the very systems it once differentiated itself from. If distributions lock down certain aspects for simplicity, if they rely more heavily on corporate backing, or if they prioritize commercial partnerships, does that dilute the original ethos? It's a delicate balance between accessibility and authenticity. Another dimension to this debate is education. Historically, many people learned core computing concepts through Linux. They learned how operating systems manage processes, handle file systems, and configure networks, because Linux exposed these mechanisms more transparently. If modern Linux hides complexity behind graphical tools, will fewer users gain that deep understanding? Or will the curious still find their way to the command line when they're ready? The answer may lie in intent. An operating system should serve its users, not test them. If someone wants to use Linux to write documents, browse the web, and play games, they shouldn't be forced to learn shell scripting. At the same time, Linux remains one of the best platforms for exploration. The tools are still there, the documentation still exists, the source code is still open. Ease of use doesn't remove the possibility of mastery. It simply removes the requirement. There's also a generational shift happening. Younger users who grow up with smartphones and tablets expect intuitive interfaces. They are used to tapping icons and swiping gestures. If Linux wants to remain relevant, it can't rely solely on nostalgia for the days of manual configuration. It has to meet users where they are. That doesn't mean abandoning its roots. It means evolving. Interestingly, even as desktop Linux becomes easier, the server and development worlds remain deeply technical. Linux continues to dominate in cloud infrastructure, containerization, and DevOps workflows. Tools like Docker, Kubernetes, and countless programming environments rely heavily on Linux. In these contexts, the command line is alive and well. So perhaps the desktop experience becoming easier doesn't erase Linux's technical depth. It simply broadens its appeal. There's also the diversity of distributions to consider. Not all Linux experiences are equally simplified. Some distributions focus on user-friendliness, while others intentionally preserve a more hands-on approach. This diversity is one of Linux's greatest strengths. If someone wants a guided, polished experience, they can have it. If someone wants to build their system piece by piece, they can do that too. The ecosystem accommodates both philosophies. So is Linux becoming too easy? In some ways, yes. Tasks that once required research and troubleshooting now take minutes. Installers are smarter. Hardware support is stronger. Software distribution is streamlined. For users who remember the early days, the contrast is dramatic. But whether that's a problem depends on what you believe Linux should be. If you believe Linux should be a proving ground for technical skill, then ease of use might feel like dilution. If you believe Linux should be a universal, empowering platform accessible to everyone, then ease of use is a triumph. Perhaps the real strength of Linux lies in its ability to be both. It can welcome beginners without abandoning experts. It can provide simplicity without sacrificing depth. In the end, making Linux easier doesn't remove its complexity. It simply moves it from the surface to the foundation. The power is still there for those who seek it. The difference is that now you don't have to struggle just to get started. And maybe that's not a problem at all. Maybe that's progress.